Thank you all for joining me. This week, the Supreme Court heard arguments in a very important case called Voisin versus United States, which will determine whether violent domestic abusers can have guns. Right now, in many states, there's a loophole that allows a violent domestic abuser to continue buying guns even when there is a restraining order against him, and even when they have been convicted of a violent crime related to domestic abuse. Under current law, some domestic abusers who have been tried and convicted of their violent crimes are allowed to buy guns. And if the court rules the wrong way in Voisin, then convicted domestic abusers in a majority of states will be allowed to legally own guns. We know that domestic abuse is a violent crime that in too many cases can even lead to murder. But when a gun is involved, the problem is even worse. When a gun is in the home, domestic violence is actually 5 times more likely to lead to murder. We have to protect our survivors of domestic violence. If someone beats their spouse, they shouldn't be able to get a gun. If someone abuses their partner, they shouldn't be able to get a gun. Domestic abusers are not law-abiding citizens. They should not have access to guns. So while the Supreme Court plans to rule on this case, I'm urging my colleagues in the Senate to do everything we can to protect survivors of domestic violence. I'm proud to support 2 bills that would help keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. Both of these bills are being led by my colleague from next door, Senator Blumenthal. The first bill I'm supporting is called the Lori Jackson Domestic Survivor Protection Act. Right now, when a victim of domestic violence asks for help, the court can issue a temporary restraining order to keep the victim safe before a permanent restraining order is issued. It can take weeks or even months for a judge to issue a permanent restraining order. The federal laws we have now prevent any domestic abuser with a permanent restraining order from having a gun. But the law doesn't apply to domestic abusers who still only have a temporary restraining order, even though it's right when the abuser discovers they have a restraining order against them and they are the most dangerous. The Lori Jackson Domestic Survivor Protection Act would close this loophole. It would ensure that anyone with a restraining order related to domestic violence would be banned from having a gun. And it would also expand the definition to an intimate partner so that a domestic abuser who doesn't live with the victim can still be held to the same legal standard as the abuser who does live with the victim. Because right now, the law only bans domestic abusers from having guns if they actually are married to their victim or have children with them or live with them. We call this the dating loophole, and we know that this doesn't reflect the reality of domestic violence in America today. The second bill I'm supporting is called the Domestic Violence Gun Homicide Prevention Act of 2015. This bill would give states, including New York, new resources to protect domestic violence victims from gun violence. It would help states take guns away from violent domestic abusers who have no business owning guns. No violent domestic abuser should be allowed to own a gun. Enough women have fallen victim to this horrible crime. So I'll keep fighting for this legislation in Washington, and I urge everyone to raise your voices against domestic violence and help make sure that violent domestic abusers can't possess guns.